in the vast majority of negotiations, common ground ensures that the transaction is in both parties' interests.
Right.
If it's not, they just don't agree to the transaction.
Right.
The only possible exceptions are, if a person agrees to something they don't like to prevent something that's even worse, then, sometimes that gets a little tricky.
Yeah.
Like, the company that you're working for will either cut your salary in half or you lose your job. I mean, that's a really horrible situation.
That's rough.
It doesn't happen often.
Right.
But
It just happened to a bunch of pilots, though.
yeah. And,
I could see that.
And some pilots said, no, that's stupid. I'm just going to leave. And some pilots said, you know what? I would rather keep my job at less salary. So common ground makes sure that typically a transaction is in both parties' best interests.
Okay.
Now, there may be parts, and the pilot salary negotiation is a great example of this, okay? For the pilots to be paid more means that the agency or businesses paying them have to give up more. Okay,
Right.
so transactions typically on the whole are win-win, otherwise they don't happen. But there are certain parts of negotiating the agreement that a gain for one is necessarily another person's loss.
Right, just by definition. Yeah.
That's hard. Okay? And
Yeah.
here's the other thing too. When you're having some type of negotiation, typically if it's a relationship type of thing, so it's not like, you're selling lemonade to somebody you're never going to see again. It's not a transactional sale, it's a relationship thing. Like a salary negotiation, you're going to be working with these people.
Yeah.
You don't really want to tick them off.
Yeah.
And so they hate you for the rest of the time you're working. I mean, that doesn't work at all. So there's a fine balance of you want to negotiate as much as you can to get the best deal that you possibly can, but you don't want to negotiate too much or you risk really ticking people, the people you're negotiating with off.
Yeah.
And if you do that enough, the deal's not going to go through anyway. You offend somebody or whatever and, no deal, which is not a good thing either. So there's a specific practice called using a buffer that's really, really helpful.
Yeah.
And you can see this, a good example of a buffer. Think of a, professional athlete, okay? Negotiating multi-million-dollar, multi-year deals to play for a particular team.
Right.
Okay? Now, the player could choose to negotiate themselves. Okay? But let's say they play hardball on the salary.
Right.
And they really tick off the manager and the owner of the team. They say, you know what? You're a pain in the butt. We don't want you to play for us. We're done. That's not good.
Yeah.
Okay?
Nobody wins, really.
Nobody wins. Okay? So, but the athlete still wants to make sure they're getting a really good deal.
Sure.
It just may not be a good idea for them to do that themselves.
Okay.
Okay? So, hiring an agent to negotiate on their behalf, an agent is a buffer. It's a person in between them and the owner or the manager.
Right.
And the agent's sole job, and the owner and manager know this, is to get the very best deal possible for that athlete.
Right.
Okay? So they can play hardball, they can ask questions, they can push further, they can bring up issues that the athlete could not or would risk really ticking somebody off
Okay.
if they did that directly. Okay? So that allows them to be much more aggressive during those parts of the negotiation where it's a win-lose type of thing. But, the owner and the manager can think that this athlete's agent is being a pain in the butt. But they can still love the athlete. They can still want them to play for them. So adding a buffer allows them, it helps everybody because it allows the athlete to get a much better deal. And they'll typically get a much better deal that even after paying the agent a fee or a commission for their part, they still come out ahead.
Yeah.
And then it also allows a deal to be reached for the owner and the manager that doesn't involve getting really ticked off at the athlete.
Yeah.
For all these things.
I had a girl send me her really, really, really tough French grandma to negotiate her wedding dress to try to be her buffer. She was really hard.
Yeah. But you couldn't get mad at her because you had the grandma.
She just had an annoying grandma.
Right. So The other thing too, and there are also all sorts of buffers. So
Yeah.
professional athletes typically have an agent, but they also have a lawyer who will actually go through the contract and go back and forth about this is acceptable or no. And that
This
can be
verbiage.
Yeah, that can be a really big pain in the butt.
Yeah.
And if the athlete is doing that, they may not be able to because they don't have the experience. But the lawyer can also go back and forth and make demands that the athlete wouldn't have either the knowledge or be in the position to be able to do that.
Which is not to say anything about athletes. Even with Josh's book contract, there were things, little teeny tiny phrases that we had no idea what they would mean down the line that Josh's agent let us know about, and we had to get them fixed.
Yeah. So in many ways, my agent Lisa is a buffer, and she's a really, really good one, and I'm happy to work with her. And it's so if you're working with, particularly if you can work with experts, so people who have been doing what you want to do for a long period of time, book agents, financial advisors, lawyers, tax attorneys, all of these things, these people who have deep knowledge about something you need to do.
Grandmas.
Using them as a buffer can be quite valuable. Both because of you're separating some distance. It's also good to use a buffer to put some distance or slow a negotiation down a little bit, because sometimes the back and forth can get really heated and you can start to feel really pressured.
Right. Do I really want to do this?
Yeah, to
right
agree
now?
to something now.
Yeah.
And, having a buffer to confer with can help slow things down enough so you don't get all emotional, excited, and you can actually go through a process of conferring and actually decide on a more rational basis what you like to do.
Right.
So that's also a good benefit.
Okay.
Now, one thing that's really important, and we'll talk more about this in the human minds section, but your agent or your buffer or your broker or whoever you're working with, they may not have the same incentives as you do. They may not want exactly the same thing as you do. And so, a good example is real estate agents.
Oh, yeah.
Typically act as a buffer between the buyer and the seller of a house. Okay, and sometimes there's one agent, and sometimes there's a buy side agent and the sell side agent. So let's assume you're trying to buy a house, and you're working with an agent to find one. Okay, now that agent typically, at least in the U.S., maybe different around the world, is paid on commission. Okay, and that commission is based on two things. Number one, it's contingent on you actually buying a house.
Any house.
Okay? And the larger the size of the house you buy, the higher the commission is.
Right.
Which is why, if you talk to most real estate agents, at least who operate on this incentive structure, they will do two things. Number one, they'll always tell you that the best decision you can ever make is to buy a house. Doesn't matter. Renting is a really bad deal. Universally, you're wasting your money, flushing it down the toilet. You should buy a house. Okay? The other thing is you should always buy the most expensive house that you can afford. It's a good financial situation. It'll be worth more. You can sell it for more later, all this stuff. Okay? Their incentive is to get you to A, buy a house, any house, and 2, buy the most expensive house you can afford, because that's what maximizes their pay. Okay, even if you don't have enough money to buy a house, or if it's not a good idea for you to buy a house, or renting would serve you much better, they're going to push you to buy a house because their incentive structure is to have you buy a house.
And they've got a big mortgage to pay. So
right. Okay. So always be mindful of the incentives that your buffers have when you're dealing with them. Another example is sometimes people work with brokers or financial advisors, and they give control over their investment accounts to the broker, and the broker can manage their money as much as they want. Now, those brokers are also sometimes paid on commission.
Yep.
And that commission kicks in when a security is bought and when a security is sold. So the more the broker does what's called churning the account, they buy and sell all the time, the more they buy and sell, the more money they make. And if you're not aware of that, that can be a really big detriment to using a buffer, because they may not be making the best decisions for you. So, this whole process of aligning interests, of making sure your agent or your buffers interests are exactly the same as much as possible as yours, that can make sure you're both on the same page, and the things that your agent or buffer does on your behalf are going in the direction that you want to go. And so just be aware of incentives, understand what your buffers are being compensated for. You know, a lot of times it's much better to, instead of, you know, operating on an incentive or a commission structure, just to offer a flat fee. So it's like, you know, whether we buy a house or not, I am going to pay you X amount of dollars to help us negotiate the deal. Is that okay? And by doing that, you make sure that their job is to do whatever is in your interest, and they're not factoring in other things. So, you know, there are things that you can do there to mitigate your risk there. Using experience buffers is really good. Just be aware of what the incentive structures are.
Okay.
And understand how you can use them well and some of the pitfalls, and you'll be all right.